Hi everyone, and welcome to this Innovating for Good YouTube live session. I'm Chris Ernie from the UNHCR Innovation team. Innovating for Good is a monthly YouTube live series hosted by UNHCR Innovation and Plus Social Good that's meant to spark conversations on innovation in the humanitarian sector. In this October session, we bring together an energetic panel. I'd like to welcome Rachel Mayer. Rachel's a media and communications professional with extensive experience as a producer, manager, and trainer on projects in Australia, Greece, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Sri Lanka, with a focus on human rights, migration, and conflict. She's worked as a project director and consultant in humanitarian and media development contexts, now for UNHCR in Greece, previously with the Internews Network, BBC Media Action, and Overseas Consulting, specializing in areas in access to information, freedom of expression, new media, technology, and advocacy initiatives. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Paula Schwartz. Paula created a mobile think tank called the Startup Boat to build innovative solutions to the refugee crisis in Europe. On Startup Boats, innovators of different fields come together at border regions within Europe where previously high numbers of refugees were arriving. Out of Startup Boats have grown different solutions in the areas of healthcare, fintech, shelter innovation, connectivity, crisis management, and mobility that have had a total of 2 million users so far. Paula co-initiated the project RefugeeHost.com during Startup Boat in Greece, together with Danielle Cadenal. Lastly, I'd like to introduce you to Mike Butcher. Mike Butcher's day job is as a journalist and editor-at-large of TechCrunch, the breaking news website about the high-tech world. Mike has been named one of the most influential people in European technology by Wired magazine and is a regular broadcaster with CNN and the BBC, among others. He's been an advisor on tech startups to the British Prime Minister and also the Mayor of London. But in this context, he's the founder of the charity techfugees.com, which seeks to inform and ignite the tech startup world and technologists to the issues faced by refugees and refugee NGOs. Today, we're going to take a deeper look at the role of the tech startup communities in responding to humanitarian crises. With the recent influx of refugees and migrants into Europe, the tech startup community have stepped up to do their part, offering a range of new gadgets, apps, and bright ideas. This is an engaged host community committed to developing solutions for refugees, and it's great to see. But it also begs a number of questions. Can a new app really solve the most complex challenges facing newly arrived refugees into Europe? Is new technology really the cure-all solution? Is this approach doing more harm than good? Before we jump into the conversation, if you're listening to the discussion online, please make sure you use the hashtag #InnovForGood on Twitter, and to tweet our panelists your questions, we will answer them during the latter part of the conversation. Okay, let's start. I've got a few key questions to each of you, but I'm going to start with Rachel. So Rachel, you're in Greece, you're working for UNHCR at the moment, but you've got a range of experience across the world, and including with the Internews Network. How can we recognize opportunities to really help in a humanitarian response based on listening to the needs of the field, rather than centralized technology or remotely driven impulses to help?
Thanks, Chris. Well, I think one of the most important things to think about is actual innovation itself, rather than start with a particular technology or the idea of like, I want to do a startup, to think about the very back to basics idea of innovation, which is to be and responsive and to respond to a demand. And I think one of the things that we've seen happen here is that there's been an oversaturation of apps. This is well documented. There's a bit of an app default. I want to help the refugees, so maybe there's an app that can help. And I think there's a sense that that you dive in from that end before coming back to the sort of basics, like I said, of innovation, which is more about, in my opinion, a real interrogation of need. And to actually get into the field somehow and to really understand what people are missing in their lives. And quite often, I mean, very much when I talk to people here about this question, people still need connectivity. What's missing is Wi-Fi. That's you know, there's a few people working on that very well. There's a connectivity project, but it's still slow. People will tell you the first thing they want is Wi-Fi. After that, yes, there's a concept that smartphones have proliferated and that everyone has one. Smartphones I've seen in refugee sites here that have a smashed screen. So, I mean, very practically, Wi-Fi and phones are still so fundamental to people and still needed more than apps. Because one of the other things, and I'll stop here, is that people need access to services and they need human responses. So in a minute, I can talk about some recommendations that we've sort of recognized here, but I think one of the fundamental things to recognize is that an app cannot get your daughter to a doctor to get her an appointment for surgery because she needs that, or help you understand, or, you know, give you access to a legal procedure that will about your life. And these are much more about technology, but that's the sort of opening, I guess, comments from here.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Rachel. Very interesting points, very prevalent. Turn to you. You've been vocal about listening to the needs of communities, and this is something that you've that I think has been driving your work at Tech4Gs. Are there examples where startups and the tech industry are including the voices of refugees in the process of creating solutions? Mike, just before you carry on, you're just still on mic there, on mute, sorry.
Sorry about that. Technology, I'm supposed to be good at this. The issue is that I'm delighted, by the way, to be here. Thank you very much to UNHCR and to Social Good for inviting me onto the show today. The issue is, and I completely concur that with Rachel, that there has been a massive proliferation of apps and things, and that's highly understandable, because we're talking about is a very engaged community in the technology world, and they would love to do their bit to help refugees and to help NGOs. Obviously, for the last year or so, we've seen some terrible images on our TV screens and across all media. And what seemed to happen was an overwhelming kind of desire by the tech community to get involved, and that's totally understandable. What actually happened, I think there's a timeline here, and as somebody who created a community organization, a volunteer group called Tech4Gs to try and corral this enthusiasm, quite clearly what happened was that there was enormous amounts of interest. What can we do? Let's do hackathons, let's create apps. You know, all these refugees are wandering around with smartphones, and that's, you know, real opportunity. It's the 21st century. It's not 1939. It's not 1945. There must be something we can do. That's entirely understandable. I think the initial wave was, let's get people in a room and let's kind of like try and imagine what it's like to be a refugee. And because a lot of these guys didn't really have access to refugees and hadn't necessarily reached out to NGOs. What happened over the next few weeks and months, and this is what we tried to do at Tech4Gs, was to have a real conference, real hackathons, co-create with NGOs, co-create, also find refugees and get them involved in the projects. And as a result of this sort of year-long process, we've obviously come out with a set of ideas and learnings, which you can find on tech4gs.com. We've created many different channels on Slack, on Facebook, Twitter, email newsletters about some of these initiatives, even our own Wikipedia, fast Wikipedia page you can get from tech4gs.com, and to try and corral that enthusiasm. Now, the issue to really address this is that there has been an oversaturation of apps. In the technology world, that's not a bad thing, because innovation means that, you get to basically create lots of things. Some of them work, some of them don't. But obviously, when you're talking about human beings, you don't want to deploy something into the field that actually might not work or might put someone in danger. And this is something that has to be constantly emphasized, is the security of these technologies, whether they're identifying people. These are the kinds of things that have to be emphasized over and over again in order to get people involved in the field. The only thing I would say is that the technology world will actually come up with some brilliant solutions in the next few years, and we've got to start the process now. As smartphones deploy, as connectivity improves, gets better, and as technologists themselves get involved in the issue of creating more connectivity and co-create with NGOs and refugees, there will be more and more solutions which come out. And to speak to Rachel's point about whether or not an app can get me an appointment for a doctor or can it sort out my legal issues, interestingly enough, there are actually things now starting to come out which can address this. The confluence of artificial intelligence, chatbots, AI, with things like legal issues or finding you a doctor, or even just basic technologies like Skype, for instance, are starting to address some of these issues. And that's really where we need to sort of come together to find the things that work, and also to innovate in a kind of sandbox away from human beings, so that the things that do get deployed are robust and actually do work in the field.
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks very much for that reply, Mike. I wanted to bring Paula into this conversation as well, from where you are currently in Singapore, Paula. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that there have been more tech startups focusing on humanitarian relief than before? And then secondly, what makes these special? I mean, hasn't this been happening across, for example, Africa for the last few decades in any case? But let's start with the first question. Have there been more tech startups focusing on humanitarian relief than before? Over to you, Paula. Paula from Startup Boat.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. I'm actually in Jakarta, returning from a expansion of the Startup Boat to Asia, and I deeply apologize for the fact that I'm in a car, but I'm heading to the next Startup Boat in Greece right as we speak. Concerning your question, of course, as Mike already mentioned, there have been a lot of tools that were developed simply also because people feel very closely to the topic. Developers nowadays around the world really are becoming more and more. So you can learn to code at home in areas also that are not affected in any way by this phenomenon. And what has happened a lot is that very capable entrepreneurs with tech skills were working in their usual businesses, and then they saw a chance to actually create something out of their business that could potentially also then support newcomers or refugees of war. So that has been happening throughout different sectors. Currently, for example, I'm working with a friend of mine from MLab who has a container business, and he then changed a container in partnership with Cisco, which is another technology company, to turn it into a first response center for refugee camps. And this is actually also the device that we will be testing on the next trip with the Startup Boat. So just to give you an example of what has been happening, and then another phenomenon that you see a lot is that the tech giants understand that they do have a certain responsibility to come in, because giants like Google have such a wide understanding of what's happening around the world because of tools such as Google Maps or Google Analytics. And so they are able to provide a form of transparency that the political sector cannot at this point in time, because just they collect data in a very effective way. And I think it's great that they're making moves to also be part of innovation. And concerning your second question, I don't know if I should already answer that, or if you want to phrase it again.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll go back to the first question actually. So do you think that there are more tech startups focusing on humanitarian relief before? Is that something that you think you would say is happening globally, or is this just Europe focused?
I think it's very much focused on Europe due to the phenomenon of mass migration that we're seeing right now. But as a global trend, you know, you had the usual entrepreneurship, the tech entrepreneurship come up, where people were developing tools, and then the first people were actually making good money with those tools, and you had the tech entrepreneur boom, and people then realized that they don't want to build things that maybe just fill a gap in the market, but they want to become so-called social entrepreneurs. So then out of the usual tech entrepreneurs, you had the tech social entrepreneurs. And now that we actually face a humanitarian crisis, obviously the interest to develop something that also solves immediate problems and serves needs of those who need support the most, that is just something that results out of this crisis that we're seeing in Europe. However, you also have the phenomenon of mass migration at the border, for example, between the US and Mexico. Also here where I am at the moment in Asia, there's a refugee problem in Indonesia, and there are patterns that are scalable across regions that are experiencing the same phenomenon, but the scaling process is a different one than with a normal business. I'm sure Mike would confirm this as well. But in general, I would say, yes, it's gone up very much.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. That's some interesting insights into what you've seen. Rachel, on the above, how can we as traditional humanitarians, and I say that very much in traditional, I say that very much in inverted commas, because I think our space has evolved over the last few years, especially in terms of our engagement with private sector organizations. But how can we as more traditional humanitarians partner with startup organizations and movements such as Startup Boat, or such as Tech Fugees, or any of the startups that we saw in the Europe crisis? Over to you, Rachel, from UNHCR, now previously of Internews.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'd just like to respond a little bit to some of those points that Paula and Mike have made, because I think there's something interesting that happens when we divide. You know, the humanitarians are sort of out there and they've got their sleeves rolled up and they're in the field working with people trying to help. And then there's this sort of idea that, I mean, yes, as you say, we're not separated. There's not a separate sort of group of people who, and there's no connection. I think there's experts in each of those fields, and there's a lot of crossover, more so than there used to be. But I still think back to my first point about, I think there needs to be a really deep interrogation of what it means to help. And I think this is the same for humanitarians as it is for technologists or people who are interested in setting up a startup or developing an app or using technology to provide assistance. And in the same way that humanitarians within our own sector are forced to interrogate our own motives and how useful we are. It's like, you know, I want to get in there, I want to help the migrants that are coming to Europe, go to Lesbos and, you know, and work in that capacity. The same thing I think has to happen with technology. While I completely embrace and endorse its potential, I still think that there's, even Paula, that you're talking about people going, well, we've got these skills or technology at our fingertips, we want to help, it'll be good for our business. That's fine. But I do talk to people here who say, but what does it do for me? So I think there's just a sort of a bit of an existential question for all of us there, just put that there. What I do think is that there's an enormous amount of value, I think, for technology to support humanitarians better in the management of information for the rapid processing of asylum claims, so that cases are not, you know, put on a pile and not, you know, not dealt with quickly. There's many host and destination countries, Greece is one of them, where there is not necessarily as much capacity or preparation as there be if to process people's not just their asylum issues, but their health, their education, their shelter. I mean, I was interested in Paolo talking about the container project, because that's actually where people's needs are. They're worried about winter. They're worried about, of course, there's you know, calling home and things like that, but there's very basic fundamental needs and issues of dignity that I do think that the tech community could really support humanitarians with, because a lot of it is about management and coordination. And the last point I'll make is that in all of this, what I really think that to see the technology community focusing on is human-centered, not just human-centered design, but human-centered solutions, where there's people built into the process. Apps are fantastic. Build in the capacity for people to come and teach people how to use things, or train people, or personally with the app in hand. And that's where I just think, you know, we just really have to build the human interaction back into these methods of supporting. And I think, I mean, I think technology has that capacity, obviously, but I think without humans bringing it, it just doesn't have as much impact as it otherwise would.
Thanks, Rachel. I wanted to actually follow up with Mike here, because I think some of the points that he'd made earlier about you know, we need to invest now. We need to invest the work now, and then we, you know, basically we may reap the rewards later on. So I wanted to ask you, Mike. I could ask you how can we use how can innovation use technology to drive useful responses? And I think that you probably have quite a long list of things that already exist out there. What I'm wondering is what you think. Yeah, no, absolutely. So we can start with that. But what I want to segue into is what you see the technology space being in 5 years' time, and that's because that's what we should be heading towards. So let's start first of all, because I asked that question because it links into what Rachel was saying about our kind of combined understandings of the protection space, the combined understandings of the needs of people, and you know, often we'll be coming up at this from a couple different directions. So let's start with, you know, some of the most prevalent examples that you've seen recently, and then I'd like you, if you could, take us through what you see the next 5 years looking like, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's give you some examples of what's going on out there. For instance, in the last year, you've seen some startups trying to address connectivity, and there's some fantastic initiatives out there. A chap called Everbot has been running a brilliant initiative to get people connected up in Lesbos and some of the Greek islands. But also, you had people in the Balkans, technologists in the Balkans, coming up with some ideas. So there was a company, or a bunch of geeks basically, who hacked together a thing called Meshpoint, which was a rugged mobile Wi-Fi. Literally put it on their back on a rucksack with a bunch of big batteries and SIM cards, and literally walked around with a Wi-Fi node to allow refugees who were landing at the point, this is talking a few months to a year ago, to allow them mobile Wi-Fi. Lots of initiatives around mobile Wi-Fi and connectivity. At the very sort of far end of things, there's now actually a startup now out of London called Aid Tech, which is being deployed in Lebanon as a test at the moment. And the idea there was to use the blockchain plus vouchers. So vouchers with a QR code, which could be read with a smartphone app. That data was connected to the blockchain, which is the global network which powers Bitcoin, which could then register whether or not aid had actually been delivered to that individual using these vouchers connected to the blockchain. This is very, very cutting edge stuff. And obviously it's very early days, but it's fascinating to see that people are actually trying to test these kinds of things in the field. Now there's some more practical things in the education field. Coding classes, simple coding classes. This is usually for refugees who've arrived somewhere. So the REDI school, R-E-D-I, REDI school in Berlin has been training up about someone between 50 and 100 Syrian and other refugees in Berlin, turning them into high-skilled contributors to the German economy and the German society there. So education, fantastic, both, and we're talking, and then you've got, of course, Iraq Recoded, or it's been recently recalled, Iraq Recoded is now recently renamed just Recoded, which is going to be training up 150 Iraqis and displaced people in refugee camps in Iraq. In the health sector, you've got an actual commercial startup called MedShare, M-E-D-S-H-R, which is a startup outside of London, which is a little bit like Instagram for doctors. It's kind of like, what's this? Does anyone know? And it doesn't identify the patient, but it's a network for doctors to identify medical conditions. That's actually been deployed and tested in some fields. And just to sort of finish up, there's other things like, as I said earlier, there are actually chatbots and AI where you're doing messaging and say, where am I? And that's being tested right now. Not many of this stuff is being deployed, but chatbots for refugees where they can say, literally interrogate something in their own language. And then finally, you've also got language learning, incredible lots of, Integrate was a smartphone app developed in Germany to help refugees integrate in Germany. And then finally, Clouds Over Sidra was a VR movie developed to allow people in developed countries, Western countries especially, where many of these refugees are arriving, to start to empathize with the journey of refugees. Clouds Over Sidra, which was developed with the United Nations. And these are all just examples of where technology is being deployed either in sort of host nations or in the field. As I said, it is early days, and I think I'm in danger with aggressively agreeing with Rachel on some of her points, which is that I absolutely agree that you do have to have human-centered design and design thinking, and these are concepts which are very, very old, actually, to be honest with you, in the technology industry. What we had was that sort of initial burst of activity where people really wanted to kind of get involved and make things. And now we're sort of in that sort of trough where we're coming back and going, look, hold on a second, what are the actual problems? This is actually kind of what my initiative, techfugees.com, was set up to actually address, was to really an educational process to get the technology industry to understand the fundamental issues that refugees face and the fundamental issues that NGOs assisting refugees face. As one of the UNICEF's innovation officers said to me in the field in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon only a few months ago, she said, Mike, listen, we don't want unicorns, we want tech support. And this is, I think, very much where we're heading, where many of our compatriot colleagues and our fellow travelers in this space, in the tech world, are heading, is really getting involved. Getting your hands dirty is probably over-egging the pudding, but I'm saying, co-creating and actually just supporting. It can be as something as simple as setting up Wi-Fi, which that doesn't necessarily come as a first response thing, in many instances, or tech support on how some of the best tools for collaboration in the industry I work in. Everyone is now using tools like Slack. Now Slack is probably a little bit more out there for some organizations. But that's sort of the cutting edge of online collaboration right today in 2016. So there, I absolutely agree that it is going to be a long process of education and educating the technology world about how NGOs behave, work, and about the needs of refugees.
Thanks, Mike. I'm disappointed that we're all agreeing, but what I'm going to do, in which case, since we are agreeing, I want to ask Rachel. Okay, how can we support startups get their hands dirty, find out from humanitarians and persons of concern what they need first, and how can we make this support sustainable? Should we make this support sustainable, or should we be looking for one-off offers of support when and if they come? Over to you, Rachel, from UNHCR in Greece.
Okay, so you just want the golden goose thing, Chris?
Yeah, thanks very much.
All the answers. Okay, sure, I've got all the solutions. No, I think that we need to look at where the resources are. I think there's a lot of good, I mean, Mike listed a lot of really fantastic initiatives, and I think, you know, there's more, obviously. But I think then I don't want to repeat myself, but I think there needs to be this step back to, like, who is it for? And then we could do this, but who would it be good for, and who can get us to those people? So which humanitarian agencies are working on particular things? I think looking at the resources and pushing them into, I mean, I think, I don't want to speak about things I don't know all about, but I imagine there's one of the reasons why the tech community is able to consider how do I help is that there are resources that they can deploy in this environment, and they feel that they wish that they, you know, that they could apply them in the field of need. So I think looking at channeling resources is one thing, but I think in terms of your question about the collaboration, I think it's looking very much more specifically at parts of the population rather than, I mean, I think we need to avoid words like every refugee or you know, blanket solutions. Everyone with a smartphone can do this. Everyone, anything, actually. I think what we need to do is break down the population, look at specific needs, and then look at what tools we have to respond to those, and which agencies, which humanitarian agencies are already working on those areas of need. So shelter, I mean, I think Paolo's example is a great one about, you know, working with local startups on those things. I think looking, yeah, specifically at, you know, the health needs of, say, the female population in Greece. Okay, where is it missing? It's in the system of, you know, of the hospital system in Greece needs support. Can we channel the resources there? Which agencies do we need to look at that do that? So, I mean, I have no, you know, hard and fast solutions, but I think those are suggestions about redirecting the way we approach wanting to help. Who is it for? Which agencies are trying to help them already? How can I support that?
Great, thanks, thanks, Rachel. You were just cutting out a little bit there. So now the next question I'm going to put to Mike, and then Paola. We've been having a few problems connecting with you. So I'm just going to go Mike with this question, and then if you're there, then I'll flip it over to you as well.
If I just before you ask a question. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Mike.
Okay. Just before you ask, I think Rachel's a very good point. I think there has been absolutely a failing in the technology community of thinking that they can deploy one big solution for all. One of the big education projects that has to happen, that has to sort of bridge these two divides of NGOs and the technology world, is that each refugee scenario is different in lots of different contexts. And it's something that's only sort of, frankly, started to kind of come through us in the last few months as well, as we've really tried to engage. You know, the needs of a refugee in sub-Saharan Africa, where they're dealing with, they need solar power, they need to cook food, etc., which is obviously the bulk of refugees in the world. Out of the 65 million refugees there are in the world, 80% of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a different scenario to a refugee in Greece, or a refugee in Berlin. Totally different scenario, and we have to address technological solutions in those different scenarios which aid. Now, that's an educational process, that's an engagement process, and startups and the entrepreneurs and the people who want to engage with that need to be cognizant of that. That's what we emphasize all the time with tech refugees. But also, I want to say one thing, which is this, which is that there is this thing about technology which loves disruption. We love to literally leap forward 5 years into the future with something crazy that might just work. And I think that's where a lot of our technology kind of thinking comes from, the sort of technology utopianism, shall we say. And that's sort of total Silicon Valley. That's exactly what we're about. And I don't think that's something to be, dismissed. It's actually useful. The point is don't deploy something that's going to hurt somebody just because it's cool and fun and interesting. Deploy something that's that you can sandbox, in a kind of an environment, and then test it. And I think that where there's a divide between how a frustration amongst NGOs who work with technologists is that they're trying to jump 5 years ahead when there are real problems on the ground that have to be dealt with. There is a health agency in Lesbos that has to be dealt with, and they do not have modern computers or something. And, so there's no use deploying things for smartphones all the time when it ain't going to happen. So there is an absolute divide. The question is managing that enthusiasm and managing that the deployment of those resources and really getting that conversation going, frankly.
Thanks, Mike. Technology utopianism. It's a new one for me. But so this one back to you again, because you're already alluding to this. Different refugee situations are very, very different. What we saw in Europe, particularly in 2015, is very different to what we see in Uganda in 2016. We have very different backgrounds of people who are crossing international borders, and we have different terrains, different host governments, and so on and so forth. Most of the world's refugees do reside in the world's poorest nations. That's not a secret. So are the tech refugees movements, or some of the startups that you talk to on a regular basis, are they thinking about expanding beyond Europe, or will we see this focus upon Europe kind of sustained in the next few years? And I think we've lost Mike, which is a bit of a shame. So I'm going to flip this one over to you, Paula.
To make. Yeah, actually, can you hear me? Is that
we
all right?
We can hear you. Okay.
Okay, I will be slow in my response. So about the tech community, what's interesting about the behavior of an entrepreneur is that usually it's about growth, and it's about percentage of growth month over month. And what we have to understand when it comes to humanitarian projects is that if a solution is not needed, that's actually a good thing. So even if you develop something that might work for a certain period of time, if it's not needed anymore, then don't try and keep it alive, but really say that it was something that was good for the time being and that served a purpose. But if a solution is not relevant anymore, then that's also fine. And regarding Mike's point of that a refugee in Africa or here in Asia faces another scenario than in Europe, that's also true. But we are living in a phenomenon that is systemic. So you have different sectors that are affected, such as healthcare, as he said. And for example, telehealth, like remote healthcare, is also a very big topic in Africa, where you don't have such high numbers of doctors, also in rural areas. So if you use telehealth to contact a doctor to find out are these first symptoms severe, and then also potentially to link learning to that, so that people can actually doing courses. I'm not saying become a doctor over your phone. I hope this is possible at some point in time, but not yet. But at least you can take some basic education, and then you have fintech. Then I've been looking into very interesting devices or applications that enable you to understand in a better way if you are traumatized or not, so that people can actually self-check themselves. And also in the field of psychology and psychological support, there is a lot of remote solutions that that are very interesting. So I think even though, yes, the scenarios are different, this topic of applicability in different regions of the world is a very important one.
Thanks, Paula. That's great. I want to Mike's back, so I want to ask him the question that I was trying to earlier, and then we're going to take a Twitter question from the audience that I'm going to pass on to Rachel. Mike, different refugee situations require different responses. We've seen a fantastic response from civil society in Europe over the last year or so. Do you expect some of these startups to expand beyond Europe and go to some of the other regions of the world where we see very, very high numbers of refugees?
Absolutely. I think in a way you've got to think about the fact that that what happened over the last year. Although it's shameful that the technology industry didn't really get much more involved earlier on, but in a way this was a sort of a gateway drug, shall we say, to to getting technologists to start thinking about how they can help. And many of the startups that I speak to in my professional work with TechCrunch didn't realize, for instance, that they had technology that might actually assist people in the field. For instance, Busu, a startup here in London, language learning app, fast-tracked the deployment of its Arab learning language-speaking application, allowing people to learn Arabic or to learn German from Arabic to German or Arabic to English. They fast-tracked that deployment. So there are commercial organizations trying to think about these things, and as well as, shall we say, the more sort of hacker engineer guys who come out through many of the hackathons or events where people are spinning up applications and things like that. And so it is going to be a learning process. It's going to take a long time, much longer than we think, over the next 5-10 years. The World Economic Forum has identified migration and forced migration to be one of the biggest issues facing the planet because of climate change, because of global conflict. And so it's not going away anytime soon. And the one thing about technology is that it scales. The traditional approaches to migration and to refugees are fantastic, and many have obviously been incredibly efficient, and in some instances less efficient in others. But we've got to marry these two worlds in order to be able to scale the solutions over the next few years.
Thanks, Mike. I couldn't agree more.
But if I may,
I'm going to thank Paula. I'm just going to revert to a Twitter question if I can, and just noting that we're running out of a little bit of time. So I want our audience to be able to put a question to us as well. This is from Baber. She's asking, how do you engage the private sector in the humanitarian field? And secondly, how do you convince them to invest in it? So I'm going to flip this one over to you, Rachel. With UNHCR in Greece. So I'm going to repeat that question for you. How do you engage the private sector in the humanitarian field? And secondly, how do you convince them to invest in it?
Wow. I mean, I'm not sure I'm the person to answer this. I mean, I think the private sector has really a lot to offer and a lot to benefit from having a healthy global population. So, I mean, and again, I think it needs to be broken down, which elements of the private sector. I mean, I think Paula pointed out, and I'd be interested to hear what she says about this, but if the object of profit goes in directly against the object of the alleviation of poverty, of suffering, of forced migration, and of all the things that come with it, which are just horrible to conceive of, and that we see people with every day. I mean, we need to overcome that, I suppose, and I think that comes through home country advocacy, through governmental advocacy. I think it comes through putting pressure on at a very home and local level, in your own sort of democratic system and in your own commercial systems. Like, I mean, I don't know. I suppose that's, you know, a philosophical answer, but I don't think there's any, you know, obvious solutions without breaking that down. But I do think that people should focus on what is happening in my own country, in my own city, in my own house, and how do I, you know, really try to, if I care about something. And I suppose that's what our political and sort of economic systems are designed around, those concepts. I mean, I made that very broad. I don't have a practical answer to that.
No problem at all. Your thoughts, philosophical or not, are insightful. Okay, listen. I know that Rachel, you need to shoot off. I think you've got an important meeting to attend to. So I'm actually gonna close here.
You want a quick answer?
Yeah, go on, Mike.
I also want to answer something.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it, Paula.
Okay, well, we just received significant funding by Bayer Pharmaceuticals, and in the healthcare sector, Bayer is very interested to also understand how they can play an innovative role, also because a lot of difficult things have happened in the past, and I think this is also something where you can tap on people's morals and companies' morals and say, well, you know, you can make a difference now, particularly when you work in the healthcare and care sector or in the mobility sector or in the educational sector, and you can actually now change the world with what you're doing and learn from mistakes from the past and invest into things that actually make the lives of people better rather than worse. And this is one of the arguments that we're using, and it actually works. So, you know, to put pressure and to say that we're living in a crisis moment and that they have the possibility to actually do something about it. For us, we're lucky enough to say that this has worked. And also when you work, for example, with clothing companies such as H&M, you know, they have so much stock that they're not selling, that is just lying around for no reason. The amount of in-kind donations that could be organized and could go into refugee camps is amazing. And I don't understand why this is not happening more, to be honest. Also, when it comes to things like coding classes that Mike mentioned that need tech tools, but also that need basic things like furniture. So, you know, look for what can be given and build a system around it that actually organizes these things. And I think here, for example, there are also very interesting things that, you know, could be a little bit like Amazon, that actually organize donations. And this is technology based. So it's just about logistics. And yeah, that's what I wanted to say in terms of funding and in terms of in-kind donations. So there's so much stuff lying around. And second of all, you know, if there's millions and millions that can be put into startups, then I don't understand why a fund cannot give a little bit of the money that it holds to also projects that are social. So I think this is a matter of courtesy, particularly in such difficult political times.
Thanks, Paula. I'm just gonna, Mike, you wanted to make a point as well, I think.
And I just had one quick point, was that in the commercial world, Google has been deploying great resources for refugees and NGOs, and Facebook as well. And also Project Loon with the connectivity in balloons is going to be very interesting over the next couple of years. And also Facebook deploying its drones will also increase connectivity across the planet. But the other thing is also is that, you know, without, for instance, the financial support of Schibsted, who's sponsoring Tech4Gs, we wouldn't be able to have, which is a big media group in Norway, we wouldn't be able to have our hackathons and therefore engage with NGOs. So we can't deploy all these enthusiastic technologists without the support of the private sector. So they are stepping up to the plate. Obviously, it would be great if there was more, but it is happening.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks very much, Mike. Thanks very much, Paula. Thanks very much, Rachel. That's all we've got time for this YouTube Live. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining us today. You've been wonderful. It's been a very interesting conversation, and we've We've spoken about the whole length and breadth of tech startups, particularly in response to the Europe refugee crisis. Thanks also to the viewers, people on social media who have been engaging with us. If you do have more thoughts, we encourage you to continue the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag #InnovForGood. This hangout will also be available online on our YouTube channels. So this is the Plus Social Good as well as the UNHCR Innovation YouTube channels. My name's Chris Ernie with UNHCR Innovation. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.